March 12, 1944. Stalag VII-A, Moosburg, Bavaria. The barracks smelled of wet wood and unwashed men. 200 Allied prisoners of war, mostly American airmen shot down over Germany, lived in wooden huts surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. The compound stretched across flat gray earth. No trees. No color. Just mud and sky. The days followed a rhythm so monotonous it felt like punishment in itself. Wake at dawn to the clang of bells. Stand for roll call in frozen silence. Shuffle to collect thin soup and stale bread. Return to bunks. Wait. The waiting was the worst part. Men sat on their cots staring at nothing. Some played cards with decks so worn the numbers had faded. Others lay motionless, eyes fixed on ceiling beams. A few walked endless circles around the perimeter fence, 10 steps forward, turned 10 steps back, over and over until the guards told them to stop. Time stretched and compressed unpredictably. Hours felt like days. Days blurred into weeks. The psychological toll was invisible but devastating. Men began to forget simple things. Their mother's face, the street they grew up on, the sound of rain on a tin roof back home. Staff Sergeant Robert Harmon from Iowa watched his bunkmate, a bombardier named Phillips, sit motionless for 16 hours straight. Phillips hadn't spoken in 3 days. When Harmon touched his shoulder, Phillips flinched as though struck, then returned to staring at the wall. The camp doctor, a British medical officer captured at Dunkirk, kept meticulous notes on what he called barbed wire disease. The symptoms were consistent. Emotional flatness, loss of appetite, inability to concentrate, sudden outbursts of rage followed by days of apathy. Some men retreated entirely into themselves. They stopped washing. Stopped eating unless forced. One pilot refused to leave his bunk for a week, claiming his legs no longer worked. The doctor found nothing physically wrong. The man simply no longer saw the point in moving. Others became volatile. Arguments erupted over nothing. A borrowed spoon, a misheard comment, a sideways glance. Fistfights broke out in the washroom. Guards would separate the men and lock them in isolation cells where the silence was even worse. The German commandant, Oberst Friedrich Müller, understood what was happening. He had served in the trenches during the First World War and recognized the 1,000-yard stare. He increased rations slightly and allowed Red Cross packages through more frequently. It helped, but only at the margins. What the prisoners needed wasn't food. They needed purpose. They needed something to break the terrible sameness of each day. Without it, their minds would continue to unravel one man at a time. The Red Cross packages arrived irregularly, sometimes 3 in 1 week, then nothing for a month. Each box contained cigarettes, chocolate, canned meat, and occasionally books. The books were passed around until the pages fell out. Men memorized passages and recited them in the dark. But words on a page couldn't fill the silence. The barracks at night was a symphony of suppressed despair. Men grinding their teeth, muttering in their sleep, crying quietly into thin blankets. No one acknowledged it in daylight. To speak of breaking down was to invite it closer. Lieutenant James Cordell, a navigator from Maryland, started keeping a diary in the margins of a Bible. He recorded the weather, the meals, the mood of the guards. But mostly he wrote about the silence. "The quiet here is a living thing," he scribbled. "It wraps around your throat and squeezes." He wasn't wrong. The absence of normal sound, car engines, children playing, dogs barking, radios crackling with music, created a void that men filled with their own deteriorating thoughts. They replayed their capture in endless loops. They invented conversations with loved ones who might not even know they were alive. The camp had a makeshift chapel where prisoners could gather on Sundays. A chaplain led services using a battered hymnal. The singing was half-hearted, voices thin and uncertain. Men went through the motions, mouthing words that no longer carried meaning. By the winter of 1944, the psychological casualties outnumbered the physical ones. Men weren't dying. They were fading. And no one knew how to stop it. The guards noticed. Some of them were older men, veterans of the previous war, assigned to garrison duty instead of the Eastern Front. They saw the same vacant expressions they remembered from their own service. A few showed small mercies, an extra cigarette, a blind eye to minor infractions. But mercy wasn't a cure. The prisoners needed something more fundamental than kindness. They needed hope. They needed a reason to remain fully human in a place designed to reduce them to numbers. Private First Class Thomas Ridley from Tennessee had been shot down over Schweinfurt during a daylight bombing raid. He'd watched his crew bail out before the plane exploded. 2 made it. 4 didn't. He carried their names in his head like stones. Ridley stopped talking after the first month. He ate mechanically, slept poorly, and spent his days carving small figures from scraps of wood using a borrowed knife. He carved birds mostly. Hundreds of tiny wooden birds that he arranged in rows on his bunk. No one asked him about the birds. They understood. Each man had his own private ritual to hold back the darkness. Some counted ceiling boards. Some recited childhood prayers. Some simply endured. Then, on a gray morning in late March, everything changed. It began with a sound so unexpected that at first, men thought they were imagining it. Corporal David Keller arrived at Stalag VII-A on March 18, 1944. He came with a group of 15 prisoners transferred from another camp after a reorganization. The men shuffled off the transport truck carrying their few possessions in burlap sacks. Guards processed them through the gate. Roll call. Delousing. Medical inspection. Assignment to barracks. Keller was quiet. Average height, thin like everyone else, with dark circles under his eyes and a slight limp from a poorly healed leg wound. He claimed a bunk in the corner of Barracks 7 and unpacked his things without speaking to anyone. The other prisoners barely noticed him. New arrivals came regularly. Each one carried the same haunted expression, the same exhausted resignation. Keller seemed no different. Until the third night when he pulled something from his sack and the barracks went still. It was a harmonica. Small, silver, worn smooth by years of handling. Keller held it up to the dim light filtering through the window, turned it over in his hands, then lifted it to his lips. The first note cut through the silence like a blade. Cling. Pure. Impossible. Men froze. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Card games paused. Phillips, who hadn't looked up in days, lifted his head. For a moment, no one breathed. Keller played a slow melody. Nothing fancy. Just a simple folk tune, the kind mothers hum while washing dishes. The sound filled the barracks, sliding through cracks in the wood, rising toward the rafters. When he finished, the silence returned. But it was different now. Charged. Alive with something that hadn't been there before. Someone coughed. Another man cleared his throat. Then Harmon spoke. "Where'd you get that?" Keller looked at him. "Had it in my boot when they shot me down. Guards never found it." "Play something else," another voice called out. Keller considered this. Then he lifted the harmonica again and played Home on the Range. The melody was simple, almost childlike, but grown men found themselves blinking back tears. It wasn't the music itself. It was what the music represented. Sound made by human breath and human fingers. Something created, not just endured. A reminder that they were still capable of making beauty in this place. That night, Keller played for 20 minutes before a guard banged on the door and told him to stop. He packed the harmonica away. But the damage was done. The seed was planted. The next evening, men gathered around Keller's bunk before he even took out the instrument. No one asked permission. They simply appeared, sitting on footlockers and floor, waiting. Keller played longer this time. Shenandoah. Red River Valley. Amazing Grace. Songs everyone knew. Men began humming along quietly. Some closed their eyes. Others stared at the harmonica as though it were a sacred object. Phillips, the bombardier who had stopped speaking, whispered the words to Red River Valley under his breath. Harmon heard him and felt something crack open in his chest. By the end of the week, the evening concerts had become ritual. Men returned to their bunks immediately after evening roll call. They saved bread from dinner to eat while listening. They sat in silence until Keller began, then let the music wash over them like rain. The transformation was subtle at first. Men started washing more regularly. Arguments decreased. The 1,000-yard stares softened slightly. Phillips began speaking again, short sentences but words nonetheless. Ridley, the man who carved birds, approached Keller one evening. "Could you play Tennessee Waltz?" he asked. His voice was rusty from disuse. Keller nodded and played it. When he finished, Ridley said, "My wife and I danced to that at our wedding." Then he walked back to his bunk and, for the first time in 3 months, smiled. The music created something unexpected. Community. Men who had been strangers now had a shared experience. They talked about Keller's playing during the day. They requested songs. They debated which melody was best. The conversations were simple, but they were conversations. Lieutenant Cordell wrote in his Bible diary, "There is a man here with a harmonica. He plays every evening. I cannot explain what it does, only that the barracks feels less like a tomb." The German guards noticed the change. The camp's psychological temperature had shifted. Fewer fights. Fewer men in the isolation cells. The doctor reported improved morale across the compound. Oberst Muller considered banning the harmonica. Music could be used to mask planning, to signal, to coordinate. But he was old enough to recognize something more important. Hope was not a security risk. Despair was. He let it continue. By April, word had spread to other barracks. Prisoners from across the camp began appearing outside Barracks 7 in the evenings, standing in the cold to hear Keller play through the walls. The guards didn't stop them as long as they remained orderly. Keller's repertoire expanded. Men taught him songs from different regions: Appalachian ballads, Irish reels, work songs from the South. He learned them all by ear, memorizing melodies after hearing them once. The harmonica became a bridge. A farmer from Nebraska discovered he shared a love of bluegrass with a mechanic from Louisiana. A schoolteacher from Boston taught lyrics to a factory worker from Detroit. The music dissolved the invisible walls men had built around themselves. But it was more than entertainment. The music was medicine. It gave structure to shapeless days. It provided something to anticipate, something to remember. Time began to feel linear again instead of circular. Men started making plans. When Keller plays Danny Boy, "Tonight I'm going to write a letter home," one man said. "I'll finish my carving during the concert," said another. The music anchored them to intentionality. Phillips, the bombardier, began drawing. He sketched portraits of the other prisoners using charcoal made from burnt wood. His hands, which had trembled for months, steadied when he heard Keller play. The music also exposed how close to the edge many men had been. Some broke down completely during certain songs. A pilot from Ohio sobbed openly through "My Old Kentucky Home." No one mocked him. They understood. The music was breaking something open that needed to break. Harmon approached Keller one evening. "Why do you do this?" he asked. Keller paused. "I had a brother," he said slowly. "Died at Kasserine Pass. When I found out, I couldn't speak for a week. Couldn't eat. Couldn't think. Then someone handed me this." He held up the harmonica. "Playing it was the only thing that made me feel human again. Figured maybe it would work for someone else." Harmon nodded. There was nothing more to say. The German guards began requesting songs. They stood outside the barracks during evening roll call, listening. A young guard from Stuttgart asked if Keller knew any Schubert. He didn't, but he learned. The barriers between captor and captive didn't disappear. But they blurred. Music was a language both sides understood. For 30 minutes each evening, they were simply men listening to another man play. By May, Keller's health began to deteriorate. The cold winter and poor nutrition had weakened his lungs. He developed a persistent cough that rattled his chest. He played through it, but the effort showed. The prisoners noticed. They saved extra portions of bread for him. They gave him their cigarettes to trade for medicine. They would have given anything to keep the music alive. One evening, Keller collapsed halfway through Scarborough Fair. Men rushed forward, catching him before he hit the ground. The barracks erupted in panic. The British doctor was summoned. He examined Keller and delivered the diagnosis quietly: pneumonia. Keller was moved to the infirmary. He took the harmonica with him. For 3 nights, Barracks 7 sat in silence. Men gathered at the usual time, but no one spoke. The absence of music was more painful than the silence before Keller had arrived. They had tasted hope. Losing it hurt worse than never having it at all. On the 4th night, a sound drifted across the compound. Faint, fragile, but unmistakable. Keller was playing from his infirmary bed. The notes were weaker, interrupted by coughing, but they were there. Men poured out of their barracks and stood in the dark, listening. Guards moved to stop them, then hesitated. Even they understood what was happening. This was more than music. This was survival. David Keller recovered slowly. The pneumonia broke, though it left him weaker. He returned to Barracks 7 in mid-May, moving carefully, breathing shallow. The prisoners had organized themselves in his absence. They'd saved every crumb of extra food. They'd negotiated with guards for additional blankets. They'd kept his bunk warm. The first night back, Keller didn't play. He was too weak. Men sat in disappointed silence but didn't complain. They understood. The following night, he managed 3 songs before exhaustion forced him to stop. It was enough. Over the following weeks, Keller's strength returned, and with it, the music. But something had shifted. The concerts were no longer just about listening. They had become participatory. Men began singing along openly. They clapped rhythm on their knees. They whistled harmonies. The barracks transformed from a tomb into something resembling a church, a place where broken men gathered to remember they were still whole. The psychological impact rippled outward. The camp doctor noted a marked decrease in what he called acute melancholia. Men who had been catatonic began engaging in basic routines. Appetite improved. Sleep quality increased. More importantly, men started planning for futures beyond the wire. They talked about what they would do when the war ended. They made promises to visit each other. They wrote letters home with details instead of mechanical reassurances. Phillips, the bombardier, completed 50 portraits. He began sketching plans for a mural he would paint when he got home. Ridley started teaching other men how to carve. Cordell organized a makeshift book club, discussing novels from Red Cross packages. The music had given them something no Red Cross package could provide: a reason to remain fully present instead of retreating into internal darkness. It proved that beauty could exist even here. And if beauty could exist, then so could hope. The other barracks noticed the change. Prisoners from across the compound began organizing their own activities. A theater group formed in Barracks 3. A debating society started in Barracks 9. A prayer circle met in Barracks 12. None of it would have happened without Keller's harmonica. He had shown them that resistance didn't require weapons. It required intention. The refusal to let captivity steal their humanity was its own form of defiance. The German commandant observed these developments with mixed feelings. On one hand, engaged prisoners were easier to manage than despairing ones. On the other hand, hope made men unpredictable. Muller decided to allow it. Not out of kindness, though he was not cruel, but out of pragmatism. A camp full of men who wanted to survive was safer than a camp full of men who had stopped caring whether they lived or died. By June 1944, Stalag VII-A had become an anomaly in the system. Other camps reported increasing disciplinary problems, escape attempts, and psychological casualties. Moosburg reported the opposite: stability, routine, remarkable morale. Senior officers from Berlin visited to investigate. They toured the barracks, interviewed prisoners, and reviewed medical records. They couldn't identify a single policy change that explained the improvement. The answer was hiding in plain sight: a small silver harmonica. When they asked Muller directly, he simply said, "The men have found ways to occupy themselves. I do not interfere with harmless activities." He didn't mention the music specifically. He suspected his superiors would not understand. The harmonica's influence extended beyond morale. It created an informal hierarchy based on contribution rather than rank. Keller wasn't an officer. He was a corporal. But men deferred to him with a respect usually reserved for commanding officers. This created tension with some of the senior officers among the prisoners. A major from Virginia attempted to ban the evening concerts, claiming they undermined military discipline. The men ignored him. Keller continued to play. Eventually, even the skeptical officers recognized what was happening. The music wasn't eroding discipline. It was preserving sanity. And sanity was more valuable than rank in a place like this. The summer of 1944 brought news of the Allied invasion of Normandy. Hope surged through the camp. Liberation felt inevitable, just a matter of time. The music took on new meaning. It was no longer just survival. It was celebration. Keller played "The Star-Spangled Banner" one evening. Every man in Barracks 7 stood at attention, hands over hearts, tears streaming down faces. Even the German guards outside paused, uncertain how to respond. It was a moment suspended between captivity and freedom. But the war did not end quickly. Summer turned to autumn. Autumn turned to winter. The initial euphoria faded, replaced by grinding patience. The music remained. It was the thread holding men together as months stretched into more months. By December, Keller had been playing for 9 months straight. The harmonica showed wear. Several reeds had cracked. The sound was rougher, less pure, but no less important. Men joked that the instrument was tired, just like them. Keller developed arthritis in his hands from the cold and the constant playing. His fingers stiffened. Some evenings he could barely hold the harmonica. He played anyway, wincing through the pain. The prisoners noticed. They fashioned crude gloves from scraps of cloth to keep his hands warm. They massaged his fingers before concerts. They would have carried him if necessary. The music had become essential. In January 1945, the sound of distant artillery began reaching the camp. The front was moving. Germany was collapsing. The guards grew nervous. Some deserted. Others became stricter, enforcing rules with sudden harshness. Oberst Muller called a meeting of senior prisoner officers. "Maintain order," he told them. "Keep your men calm. When the end comes, I want no bloodshed." It was as close to an admission of defeat as he could make. The prisoners understood. They organized themselves. They rationed food carefully. They prepared for whatever came next. And every evening Keller played. The music was a promise. They had survived this far, they would survive the rest. On April 27, 1945, American tanks rolled into Moosburg. The liberation was anticlimactic. No dramatic battle. No last-minute heroics. The guards simply surrendered. Muller handed over his command with weary dignity. The gates opened. Men walked out slowly as though testing whether freedom was real. Some fell to their knees. Others stood frozen, unsure what to do without orders. A few wept openly. That evening, 200 men gathered in what had been Barracks 7 for one final concert. Keller sat on his bunk, harmonica in hand, and played "God Bless America." They sang with him. Every voice joined. The sound echoed across the empty compound, through the open gates into the German countryside. It was the sound of men who had refused to break. When the song ended, Keller lowered the harmonica. He looked at the faces around him, faces he had played for through winter and fear and endless waiting. He tried to speak but couldn't. There were no words big enough. Harmon stood up. "You saved us," he said simply. It wasn't dramatic. It was just true. The men were processed for repatriation over the following days. Medical exams, debriefings, paperwork. They scattered to different transport points, different camps, different futures. The community that the music had built began to dissolve. Keller kept the harmonica. He wrapped it carefully in a scrap of cloth and tucked it into his pack. When an officer asked if he wanted to play one more time before leaving, he shook his head. "It's done its job," he said. Years later, psychologists would study the records from Stalag VII-A and puzzle over the data. By every metric, that camp should have had higher rates of psychological breakdown. Instead, it had lower. The clinical term they used was resilience through communal ritual. But the men who had been there knew the simpler truth. A harmonica had kept them sane. David Keller returned to his home in Pennsylvania in June 1945. He was 26 years old. He had been gone for 3 years. His mother cried when she saw him. His father shook his hand, then pulled him into an embrace. His younger sister, whom he barely recognized, hung back shyly until he smiled at her. He didn't talk about the camp. Not at first. When people asked, he gave the expected answers. It was hard, but he managed. Yes, the Germans treated prisoners decently. No, he didn't want to discuss it further. The harmonica stayed in a drawer, wrapped in the same cloth from the camp. He didn't play it. Couldn't. The instrument carried too much weight. To play it alone for himself felt like betrayal. It belonged to all of them. Robert Harmon wrote to him from Iowa. Then Phillips from Oregon. Then Ridley from Tennessee. Letters arrived every few weeks, sometimes just a few lines. "Thinking of you. Hope you're well. Remember that night you played Shenandoah?" They were checking in. Making sure Keller knew he wasn't alone. The music had connected them in ways that survived distance. In 1947, Harmon organized a reunion. 15 men from Barracks 7 traveled to Des Moines. They rented a small hall, brought their families, and spent a weekend telling stories their wives and children could barely comprehend. On the final night, someone asked Keller if he had brought the harmonica. He had. He'd known they would ask. He played "Home on the Range," the first song he'd played in the camp. The men, now husbands, fathers, civilians, sat in silence and remembered what it had felt like to be prisoners hearing music for the first time in months. When he finished, no one applauded. Applause felt wrong. They simply nodded. Some wiped their eyes. Then they moved on to other conversations, other memories. The reunions became tradition. Every 2 years, whoever could make it would gather. The numbers dwindled over time. Men died. Health failed. Families took precedence. But the harmonica always came. Keller never spoke publicly about the war. He worked as a carpenter, married a woman from his church, raised 3 children. He was quiet, methodical, kind. His family knew he had been a prisoner of war, but the details remained vague. His oldest son found the harmonica when he was 12, tucked in a box in the attic. "Can you teach me to play?" he asked. Keller looked at the instrument for a long moment, then nodded. He taught his son, "Amazing Grace." The boy learned other instruments as he grew older, guitar, piano, but he kept the harmonica. It felt important in a way he couldn't articulate. Years later, after Keller's death, the son would finally understand. Phillips, the bombardier who stopped speaking, became an art teacher. He painted murals in schools across Oregon. In every mural, hidden in the background, he included a small silver harmonica. Most people never noticed. It was his private memorial. Ridley never stopped carving. He opened a small shop in Tennessee selling wooden figurines. His specialty was birds, hundreds of tiny carved birds, each one a reminder that beauty could be made even in darkness. Lieutenant Cordell became a minister. His sermons often referenced his time in the camp, though he rarely used specific details. He spoke about hope as a discipline, a choice, something that required practice. His congregation thought he was speaking metaphorically. The German guards who had stood outside Barracks 7 listening to the music carried their own memories. Some felt guilt for their role in the system. Others felt nothing but relief that the war had ended. A few remembered the music with something close to gratitude. Oberst Müller returned to Bavaria after the war. He lived quietly, worked in his brother's printing shop, and refused all interviews about his time as a commandant. When asked once by a local journalist if he regretted anything, he said only, "I allowed small mercies when I could." It wasn't enough, but it was something. The camp at Moosburg was dismantled. The barracks torn down. The wire removed. The watchtowers demolished. Within 10 years, no physical trace remained. Housing developments spread across the land. Children played where prisoners once suffered. But memory persisted. The men who had been there carried it forward. They told their children who told their children. The story of the harmonica became family mythology, passed down like heirlooms. In 1987, 43 years after liberation, Keller attended his final reunion. Only 6 men came. They were old now, bodies failing, but their minds were sharp. They sat in a hotel conference room in Chicago and talked about the music. "Did you ever wonder," Harmon asked, "what would have happened if you hadn't played?" Keller thought about it. "Some of us wouldn't have made it," he said. "I'm certain of that." They agreed. The music hadn't just kept them sane. It had kept them alive. Not physically, they had Red Cross packages for that, but in the ways that mattered. It had preserved the part of them that made them human. Keller died in 1993. His family buried him with full military honors. The harmonica was passed to his oldest son, who kept it in a display case in his living room. He never played it. It felt sacred. The instrument sits there still. Small, silver, worn smooth by use and time. The reeds are cracked. It barely makes sound anymore. But if you hold it up to the light and close your eyes, you can almost hear the music. 200 men learned that hope isn't a feeling. It's a practice. It requires intention. And sometimes, it requires nothing more than someone willing to lift a harmonica to their lips and play. The war ended. The men scattered. The camp disappeared. But the music echoed forward, rippling through decades, carried in memory and stories and the simple truth that small acts of beauty can hold back enormous darkness. That's what the harmonica taught them. Not that suffering could be avoided, but that humanity could be preserved. Even in the worst places, even in the deepest darkness, someone can play a song. And if someone plays, others will listen. And in listening they will remember who they are. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, in a box carefully preserved, a harmonica waits. It has been silent for decades. But its work continues. The music never really stopped.